So how exactly does a text written centuries ago stay relevant and guide us today? That is a huge question, right? And it's exactly what we're diving into. We're going to explore a pretty new framework that aims to uncover the timeless, higher objectives of the Quran.
Yeah, this really is the core issue, isn't it? I mean, think about it. If you have a text that's meant to be a guide for all time, how in the world do you bridge that massive gap between its original context and our incredibly different modern world? How do you move beyond just the literal rules to find those universal ethical principles hiding underneath?
Well, the source material we're digging into today puts forward a really interesting modern method for this. It's called BioIslam, and it proposes a structured way to decode what it calls the Quran's latent principles. These are the foundational ideas that it argues are embedded deep within the text. Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start with the Quran's higher objectives in general. Then we'll look at the traditional view, Maqasid al-Sharia. After that, we'll dive into BioIslam's latent principles to see how they differ. We'll also get real about the challenges of interpretation, and finally, we'll break down exactly how these principles are extracted.
All right, Section 1, the Quran's higher objectives. The source uses this great metaphor of unlocking vast treasures. And that's really the core idea here, that beneath the surface of the text, there are these profound universal principles. The real trick, of course, is figuring out how to find the key to unlock them.
And let's be clear, this is not some New Age quest. Not at all. For centuries, literally for over 1,000 years, scholars have been wrestling with this very same question. They've developed incredibly sophisticated methods to try and grasp the ultimate purpose, the deep wisdom behind the verses.
Okay, so let's talk about the traditional view. All that historical effort eventually led to the most established framework for this kind of work, Maqasid al-Sharia.
So what exactly is Maqasid al-Sharia? Think of it this way. It's the higher objectives or the foundational goals that Islamic law is trying to achieve. It's not just about the rules themselves, the what. It's about the why, the purpose behind them, which is all about preserving essential human values.
This whole framework was developed by absolute intellectual giants, people like al-Ghazali back in the 12th century and al-Shatibi in the 14th. And their method was, well, it was complex. They were drawing from the Quran, sure, but also from the life of the Prophet and the vast hadith literature. The source we're looking at describes it as an intertwined spaghetti-like method. I kind of love that description, right? Because it captures how a single principle isn't just pulled from one line of text. No, it's woven together from all these different threads across multiple sources. And out of this intricate web, they distilled 5 core objectives: the preservation of life, intellect, lineage, reputation, and property.
All right, now let's switch gears and look at the new approach our source proposes. This is where BioIslam comes in with its latent principles. It's basically a new hermeneutic, which is just a fancy word for a new theory of interpretation. And it's centered on this idea of latent principles.
So what are these latent principles, or LPs for short? Well, in a really sharp contrast to what we just talked about, these are extracted through a linear induction process. And this is the absolute key difference. This method relies only on the Quran. That's it, just the Quran. This sets it completely apart from that traditional multi-source spaghetti method.
So here's the side-by-side. On the one hand, you've got the traditional method, the Maqasid, which is this complex system built from an interleaved reading of the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith. On the other hand, you have the BioIslam method, which is presented as a simple system based on a linear induction process from the Quran alone. It's a fundamental difference in both source material and methodology.
Okay, let's get into the challenge of interpretation. Because, and our source is really upfront about this, we have to be intellectually honest here. Anytime you're interpreting a text, you're going to face some major challenges. No method, whether it's ancient or brand new, can claim to be perfectly objective. It's just not possible.
And this isn't a criticism, it's just a reality. It affects literally everyone. The great classical commentators like Al-Tabari, they were products of their time, with their own contexts and biases. And guess what? So are we. Modern interpreters, including the proponents of BioIslam, are products of our time. Everyone's worldview, their priorities, it all inevitably colors how they understand a text.
This leads us to a really critical concept in any kind of historical analysis: presentism. You've got to watch out for this one. It's basically the trap of interpreting the past using modern-day attitudes and values. It's when we look back and judge people or texts as if they should have known what we know now.
And it can be pretty dangerous intellectually.
The source quotes a leading historian who puts it perfectly. Presentism at its worst encourages a kind of moral complacency and self-congratulation. In other words, it makes us feel smug and superior to the past, instead of actually trying to understand it on its own terms.
So the BioIslam framework argues that there are two big traps you can fall into, two equal and opposite errors. The first is the error of presentism, where you're judging the past with modern sensibilities, a kind of temporal snobbery. But the second trap is what it calls the error of traditionalism, where you idealize the past so much that you resist the moral progress that might actually be implied by the text's own latent logic. BioIslam tries to position itself as this dynamic middle path, a way to avoid both of those pitfalls.
All right, so how do they actually do it? How are these principles extracted? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of the BioIslam process. So it's a very systematic, four-step process that's meant to be based on solid research. First, they analyze the verses to pull out these latent principles. And it's not always a simple one verse equals one principle situation. Sometimes a single verse can spark multiple principles, or it might take a few verses to form one. Then, and this is a really important step, they filter for pragmatism. They essentially set aside verses that aren't directly relevant to contemporary life, like those on jinn, for example, for the purpose of this specific exercise. Finally, all those individual LPs are rolled up into bigger, high-level concepts they call the inner pillars. The whole idea is to have a system that is structured and clear.
And why go through all this trouble? Well, the goal here is incredibly practical. This is not meant to be just some abstract academic exercise. The whole point is to unlock human potential and to help us tackle what the source calls the big 5 problems facing the world today. It's really an attempt to make faith a direct, hands-on tool for solving real-world challenges. You know, it's interesting to see how BioIslam fits into this longer, dynamic tradition of interpretation. You had the traditional, complex system of al-Ghazali and al-Shatibi. Then, much more recently, you had thinkers like Muhammad Iqbal, who took this very poetic, theo-humanistic approach to find principles like love, fakr, and courage. BioIslam sees itself as the next step in this evolution, but it defines its own approach as something different, analytic and a mystical. The focus is squarely on a rational, systematic, and research-based process. So when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway? BioIslam is putting forward a structured, Quran-centric method to derive timeless values for our very modern challenges. It's a very deliberate attempt to build a bridge from an ancient text to contemporary life, to distill its ethical core in a way that feels actionable right here, right now. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on, doesn't it? We see this clear evolution of interpretation, from al-Ghazali to Iqbal to BioIslam. So if every generation reinterprets a text using its own values, its own tools, what does it even mean for a text to be timeless? Maybe its timelessness isn't about having one single, fixed meaning forever, but about its incredible capacity to spark new meaning, new insights for every generation that reads it.